Hi, everyone. Welcome to Suicide Prevention, Understanding the Increased Risks. My name is Alexandra Beineman, and I am the Associate Director of Program and Staff Development for Camber Children's Mental Health. For those of you who maybe haven't seen, we have rebranded. We were formerly known as KVC Hospitals, and we're now Camber Children's Mental Health, which is a title that just really encompasses a more holistic idea of all the services that we provide. I have been with Camber for 5 years as of this month, and I am here today with Cheryl Costable. I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Costable. I am the director out at KVC, Missouri. I am a licensed clinician in Kansas and Missouri, and I look forward to our time together.
So today we're going to be looking at some different topics. We're going to do a review of current data reported on suicidality. We're really going to dive into some special populations that are found to be at an increased risk of suicidality. And then we're going to talk about the red flags and the warning signs that we should all be aware of and be able to identify to ensure that we're keeping our youth safe.
Awesome. Today I'm just going to give you just a few statistics. I don't know if you're aware of them or not, but suicide rates decreased 3% in 2019 and in 2020 for the first time since 2000. But in 2020, almost 46,000 completed suicides. That is 130 a day that completed suicide, 130 kids. And 3.2 million plans, that equals out to be 9,090 plans a day that are made. 1.2 million attempts equals out to be about 3,409 attempts a day. It's a lot. So it's decreased, but it's still a significant number of people that are struggling. 20% of high schoolers reported having seriously considered suicide. 20% of our kids in high school. Suicide is among the 10 leading causes of death in the US. It is the second leading cause of death for our young kids, right? So our kids from 10 to 14, that 25 to 34 as well fell into that group, but it's the second leading cause, the second reason why our kiddos are dying today is because of suicide.
And this quote is from the CDC, and it says that existing data suggests that suicide rates might be stable or decline during a disaster, only to rise afterwards. And this is important for us to know. So the data that this comes from is due to some things that were collected after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And this is really important for us to know as we kind of are continuing to live through this pandemic and things are changing, as well as just some other state of the world issues we have going on right now, where certain groups may describe us in crisis. So knowing that we're kind of having that experience right now, and even though we are seeing that decrease in suicide rates, if we are not proactive with suicide prevention, we could see those rates begin to climb very shortly.
And we just think about that. I think a really good thing to talk about are what are myths and what are facts, right? So easily things are said and being able to decipher through like what is a truth and what is a myth, right? So let's just review a couple of those today. A myth, people that talk about suicide would never do it, versus the facts is suicide ideation is a predicate for those attempts. A myth is you never can tell when someone is thinking about suicide. The fact is there are warning signs that can indicate when someone is struggling. Another myth, people that threaten suicide are doing it for attention. Like we hear that one a lot. A fact is all suicide threats should be treated seriously and are a call for help. They are struggling. Another myth, asking someone about suicide will lead them to do it. The fact is, asking direct questions will allow you to evaluate the situation and respond accordingly. And I think I might have missed the attention is prevention. I think I jumped up on that one. But another myth is only trained professionals can help. All of us can ask those really hard, direct questions. Uncomfortable, but we can do it. And we don't need to be afraid to ask those questions. Another myth that's not listed on our slide is someone who dies by suicide had severe mental illness. versus the facts show suicidal thoughts are often short term, specific to a particular situation, such as divorce, breakup, legal trouble, financial issues, a death in a family, severe illness, trauma, abuse, loss of a home, but isn't always indicative of a significant or severe mental health issue. Another myth is people who are suicidal really want to die, versus the fact is those who have suicidal thoughts usually don't actually want to die. Rather, they don't want to continue living their life as it is. That's why talking about it can be so helpful. They just don't like the way it currently is or feels to them. Some risk factors, and these are risk factors across everybody that we have got listed. Mental illness, previous attempts, impulse control, financial struggles, access to lethal means. And just in there, when it talks about mental illness, when I was looking at some of the data, two significant diagnoses, really stuck out, which was depression and substance use. So I just thought that was important to notate if we're noticing someone really struggling with depression or substance abuse. ACEs, bullying, exposure to suicide, sexual violence, loss, family conflict or instability, divorce, stressful life events, traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, childhood abuse, neglect, and trauma. Risk factors in the community are barriers to healthcare, religious and cultural beliefs, poverty, violence. Some society risk factors are stigma related to mental health care, the media, cyberbullying. The relationships between risk factors and suicide for any person is complex, right? And is not exact. So the causal relationship are difficult to determine, but can be mitigated by protective factors. While it's vital we know and understand these risk factors, it is equally important that we understand each use individual situation, stay aware of our conscious and subconscious biases, and refrain from generalizations and stereotypes when we're working with our kiddos.
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about some of these, especially I think like religious cultural beliefs or like media, all of those are risk factors, but if utilized correctly, can also be a protective factor. So that really speaks to that
Yeah,
complexity of trying to identify individual risk factors.
absolutely. A quote. This is from Dr. Carl Flesher. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his name correct, but a quote that we pulled out that we thought was really powerful, where teenagers and young adults have the highest rates of suicide compared to other ages. The things that make them vulnerable are where they stand socially and where they stand developmentally. And why we thought about bringing this quote and bringing this up is because they have got this study that is going, which we're going to talk about. Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for doing this. It is the ABCD Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. If you have time, I would encourage you to take a look at it. At the end of our slide, you will have the locations that you can go to. But this is the largest study, right? It's huge. And the gentleman who wrote that quote did his fellowship at one of the research sites for this ABCD study. Just a few things I think to really notate that this is the largest long-term study of brain development in the United States. 10,000 children are being evaluated, and they're starting at the age of 9 and 10, and will continue evaluation through young adulthood. So this is super exciting to start looking at our kiddos from a young age and go all the way to they're an adult to really see what all is happening. They do study 3 areas of the brain across 21 research sites throughout our country. They're looking at emotional regulation, they're looking at the reward processing, and they're looking at the spontaneous thoughts and self-thinking and rumination. I think that is really key, like they're really showing us where they're looking at and what is impacting our kiddos, right? And as you see in our slide, they're really looking at that prefrontal cortex that's not fully developed, the judgment and decision making capabilities when they're not fully developed, the impulse control struggles, the difference in connectiveness and purpose compared to older adults, and how the pandemic, oh goodness, Alex, forgive me, I am all over myself today. How COVID has really exasperated that, and the disconnection and isolation that happened, and what is that going to mean, or how has that impacted our kids as they continue to look forward in this study. They do have several things already reported. They report out every year. A few other things that I think are going to be super important to look at, especially specific to what we're kind of talking about today, is they're linking brain function to the adolescent and the suicidal risk. They're looking at how cyberbullying is linked with suicidal thoughts and attempt. They're looking at how screen time, sports injuries, sleep patterns, ADHD medication, coffee, energy drinks, tobacco, alcohol, drugs, all of those things, and how they're impacting our kiddos' brains and what's happening with that. There's one that I really liked, and it really talked about being socially connected, getting sleep, and physical activity really equals better mental health. So just as we're talking about suicide and what are the protective factors, I think if anything I walk out of this study is really easy to remember is being socially connected, making sure we get proper sleep, and that we're physically active, we will have better mental health. Super
Absolutely.
exciting study. So please take time, if you have it, to go look at that. Alex, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, you're fine. And I was just going to reiterate, Cheryl, that all of the access to the information that's been released thus far in that study, as well as just the link to the website to kind of read about it, is going to be in the reference section in the slides that we share.
Excellent.
So now we're going to dive into special populations, and there are multiple special populations that are at increased risk for suicidality, or at just kind of like a skewed risk for suicidality. And it's important for us to understand not only who those populations are, but why that's happening. And so the first population that we're going to talk about today is Black youth in America. And so in order to talk about this, we kind of have to back up and look at what happened in 2019. And so a little bit before 2019, in December of 2018, so just before 2019 started, Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman of Wisconsin brought together the leading Black researchers and practitioners to discuss mental health solutions for Black youth. They discovered that the increasing rates of suicide among Black youth were astronomical. And the ultimate kind of result of that initial discussion was the development of the Emergency Task Force on Black Youth Suicide and Mental Health. And about a year of testimonies and hearing from researchers and working with professionals, they developed the Ring the Alarm, the Crisis of Black Youth Suicide in America report. And that was kind of a basis for looking at what are we missing? What do we need to know? They had all sorts of hearings in the development of this report. They had hearings focused on the impact of media and the impact of the faith community. They heard from Black youth on their perspectives on mental health and where some of the information maybe they don't have is lacking. And they had testimonies from people who, like the founder of the Boris L. Henson Foundation. So some pretty big names were really talking about this and diving into the disparities. And what this report discovered was that there's some major disparities in the data being reported about Black youth suicide. There's disparities in where funding is going for research, and there's disparities in diagnosis. And then additionally, there are some specific risk factors that are more acutely experienced by Black youth compared to some other populations. So let's dive into that just a little bit more. When we look at those data disparities, we can see that from 1991 to 2017, suicide attempts among Black adolescents rose by 73%. That's the fastest increase we've seen in any population. Black youth under 13 are 2 times as likely to die by suicide compared to white peers, and Black males ages 5 to 11 are more likely to die by suicide than compared to white peers. And that's a really young kiddo. You think about how young your 5 to 11-year-olds are. We're talking about really small children here. And the last data disparity that was kind of a big finding was that suicide death among Black youth is increasing faster than any other race or ethnicity. So it's something we really need to pay attention to, and something we really need to work on prevention efforts for. The second thing was that funding disparity. And what we see is that few research dollars have been allotted to organizations that are known for studying mental health to investigate these disparities. There's not a lot of dollars being thrown at this kind of huge issue or gap in data that we've seen. Black scientists are 10% less likely to be awarded funding compared to white scientists, and Black scientists are less likely to have their research proposals funded, even if they are phenomenal research proposals. So these are all things, and we spend a lot of time talking about unconscious bias and systematic racism. And I think that I'm sure that these are not always things that are happening intentionally, but because of the way our systems are built, we need to see where we're maybe failing different populations or underserving populations. And the last section that they really poured into was the diagnostic disparities. Black youth are less likely to receive treatment for depression, and when they do, it's often once they've already entered that juvenile justice system. And we talk about the school to prison pipeline and a lot of other kind of the theories and terminologies out there, and this is just due to that. So it takes them behaving in a way to then need some sort of juvenile justice intervention for them to ever have that mental health care. And then white children with behavior problems are more likely to be diagnosed with mood disorders, while Black youth are often seen as like needing discipline. So let's refer to juvenile justice, or they just have disruptive behavior. And so it's really important as diagnosing clinicians that we're aware of these unconscious and subconscious biases, that we make sure that we are challenging ourselves and that we're, diagnosing adequately across all populations. So let's talk about some of those risk factors that are a little bit more acutely experienced for Black youth. And the first one is that delinquent behavior, or that perception of delinquent behavior. They're much more likely to be perceived as having delinquent behavior, even when that behavior could be due to a mental health issue or due to some other struggle or disorder that they have. Poor familial support. Different cultures have different outlooks on mental health, and sometimes it can be difficult within the Black community or sometimes Black faith communities to really understand the impact of mental health. I think we're seeing a lot of that improve. I've attended a couple of trainings recently where Black practitioners are talking about that, and it does seem to be improving, but it's definitely still a concern that these kids aren't getting the right support they need for their mental health. Substance use, Cheryl, you mentioned that substance use was among those top two mental illnesses to increase your risk, and we see that Black youth are at an increased risk for substance use, therefore putting them at that increased risk for suicidality. Racial discrimination. Racial discrimination can be experienced by anybody of a different race, but we know we talk about racism. We see a lot of things in our media about it right now. There's a big focus on kind of breaking down that racism, and that's a discrimination that is very acutely experienced by people of color and other ethnicities and races. And so that's something that Black youth face at a much younger age and much more frequently than others. Neighborhood violence. So impoverished neighborhoods or underserved neighborhoods often tend to have that increase in violence, which obviously can increase suicidality. And then economic insecurity. Whenever we see sort of unstable economic livelihood within a community, that definitely puts everyone at risk in the community because of higher stress, feeling hopeless, etc. And as previously mentioned, the relationship between these risk factors and suicidality for any person is very complex. So we have to be aware of those stereotypes or overgeneralizations or biases. And I think that one of the largest risk factors is that lack of research. So all of those data disparities that we just discussed is a barrier and a risk factor because we cannot help this population if we're not focused on what they really need. The second special population that we are going to look at, oh, I'm sorry, we're still on Black youth. I apologize, a little ahead of myself. So let's talk about the protective factors for Black youth. So strong relationships and familial support. So it kind of was on our risk factor when we talk about their sometimes Black parents' perception of mental health. But if that relationship is there and the familial support is there, that is like their number one protective factor. I think you talked a lot about connectedness when you were looking at that ABCD study, Cheryl, and I think we see a lot of that. So as long as the understanding of the impact of mental health is there and the relationships are there, that's a huge protective factor. Same with religious involvement. It can kind of go either way. If a faith community is willing to take the time to learn and understand about mental health, then that can be a huge protective factor for our kiddos, really for all people. But if it's an organization or an institution that isn't really open to that, that can create some negativity there. Personal factors. So when we're looking at personal factors, we're looking at like positive self-esteem, emotional well-being, strong performance, academically or in sports or in a preferred hobby like music or art of some kind. All of those kind of like self-esteem boosting experiences are going to be huge protective factors for all youth, but also specifically Black youth. And then there's some social determinants such as stable housing, stable income, access to enough food, access to the necessities without, struggling to get them is also a huge protective factor. And a lot of these protective factors can be seen as universal. And if you're with us through our next few trainings, you'll hear us talk about them again. But we really should take special considerations when working with all different types of populations on what their specific barriers to these protective factors can be. So our next population, this is where I thought I was headed earlier, is American Indian and Alaskan Natives. And so this is kind of some pretty daunting data here. So suicide is the second leading cause of death in youth ages 8 to 24. And in the 10 to 24-year-old population specifically has the highest rate of death for all demographic groups. So we are really talking about a high-risk population here, and there's a lot of reasons why. First is barriers to care. So there's a lot of mistrust of government services within this population. Historically, the government has not treated this population well. There's been a lot of like forced displacement and broken treaties or promises to kind of provide different resources that haven't necessarily been provided. A lot of these communities are also in more rural and isolated locations. We know, and we'll talk about kind of rural locations here in a little bit, but we know that does put them at an increased risk due to lack of providers, as well as just kind of a different mindset of those types of communities. Inadequate funding is another barrier to care that this population often faces. Federal governments has guaranteed a lot of like grants and money to this population that haven't always panned out to create access to great care. And then the lack of cultural competence. This one was really interesting to me. Members of this population often hold a fundamentally different understanding of how these services should be given. So it is not necessarily within their culture to pay for these services, which is how a lot of our mental health institutions are set up right now. You go somewhere and you access care, and either insurance is billed for that or you pay out of pocket for that, and that doesn't really fit within the culture. Additionally, in order to kind of be culturally competent, you would need to study under an elder for many years to kind of understand all the nuances of this culture, and that opportunity doesn't come often for clinicians that are wanting to practice within this community but aren't previously part of this community. So some things we could do to really help with that would be to pour into, can we get people from this community to come train as mental health professionals? And then they have that cultural competence. We can help them build a system that works for them. And then there's some complex risk factors. This population is at an increased risk for substance abuse, like we discussed, as well as depression and diabetes, which are also risk factors for suicidality. There's a lot of generational trauma with the historical mistreatment, that forced displacement. The multi-generational impacts of that are astounding and create multi-generational trauma and depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses. Community struggles are a complex risk factor for these people. Many people in this population are deeply affected by poverty or have like a lack of employment or increasing homelessness, and that obviously increases your risk for suicidality. And then lastly are some community misunderstandings or mental health stigmas within this community that talking about suicide will make it happen, which Cheryl, you addressed in our myths and facts section. The belief that suicidality is only a cry for help and that that's not really like the severity of it. The belief that people who are struggling with suicide are just having a difficult time and that will pass, or that if someone has decided they're going to end their life, there's nothing we can do to help them. So trying to really break down some of those myths and facts like we did before and help kind of destigmatize mental health within this community would really help create a protective factor rather than a complex risk factor. So the data that's on this slide is from the ACOMA project. The ACOMA project is a nonprofit organization developed to meet the mental health needs of youth of color. And so this is from their 2022 Mental Health for Youth of Color survey. And you can see the different sections we're looking at up here. So we have Black youth, Latino youth, Asian youth, Native American youth, and multiracial youth. And so those colors stay the same throughout these graphs. And this is the first study of its kind. So hopefully we can continue to do studies like this in about 3,000 youth of color, including people up to the age of 25 and no one under the age of 13. So do remember that are included in this, but it's really interesting to look at some of the data that we see from this. So we see that 26.8 of all youth reported some sort of suicidal ideation in the past year, with no really disparity against or across racial groups. We see here that 50% of multiracial youth had thoughts of hurting themselves so that they would be better off dead. 54.9% of Native American youth. And if you look at these numbers, the lowest one we're seeing here is 45%. And the highest one we're seeing is just about almost 55%. And so about half of these youth are having that experience, regardless of their race or ethnicity. And I think that that's really astounding and should be a big red flag for us to really focus on and make sure that we're providing support. I think also seeing how many of them right here is kids who feel like they need mental health care but have not accessed it or cannot access it. And that's really interesting to kind of look at and wonder, are there things that as practitioners, as school support people, as other people in children's lives, can we break down some of these barriers to care for them? And then up here we have the 18.4% of youth reported exposure to racial trauma often or very often. And so that's where we talk about that kind of experience from a very young age of knowing that you're different, of having those traumatic experiences. So some of the key findings that I pulled from that report are that 42.1% of youth of color were exposed to at least one source of racial trauma. At least half of the youth of color reported experiencing moderate or severe depression and anxiety. So that's a really high percentage of our youth walking around struggling with depression and anxiety. And when we looked at the symptoms of that anxiety, there were certain things that were common across all youth, such as feeling anxious or worried. But when you broke it down by race and ethnicity, you could really see some different things. Our Black youth reported that they kind of had anxiety around struggling with decision making and worrying about bad things happening to them. Our Latino youth reported struggling with decision making, and our Asian Pacific Islander and Native American youth reported avoiding situations that they worried about. So that anxiety and like that rumination until avoidance would happen quite frequently with them. And then over here we can see that 30% reported needing treatment but not receiving it. And so some of that's on us as providers. We need to make sure we're doing what we can, and then also in our communities making sure that the access is there. Our next special population that we're going to be looking at today is the LGBTQIA plus population. And there are some specific risk factors or stressors for this population. The first one is the fear of being outed or of coming out. Understanding that kind of comes with like an underlying fear of rejection always. You don't just come out once as a member of this population, you come out all the time. And so you're constantly kind of grappling with that anxiety or fear. Conversion therapy is a huge risk factor for this population. It can be extremely traumatizing for LGBTQIA plus youth. Discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. So again, similar but not necessarily comparable to the experience of racial trauma, but that underlying feeling that you're not accepted, that things aren't made for you, that you may not be able to experience something because of who you are. Increased risk of homelessness. There is a large increased risk of homelessness for our LGBTQIA plus youth. I think that they're at about 130% increase. It's very large, and a lot of that is due to rejection. So kids who are coming out in their homes that are not accepting are then often kind of left to fend for themselves, which leaves them on the streets. And then additionally, it can be really difficult to find a bed at a homeless shelter if you don't kind of fit into either male or female gender identity, or also just as a minor. There's a lot of legislative threats out there. We see it in the political news all the time. There's always something being proposed against LGBTQIA plus youth. I think that this year alone, there have been 22 states that have proposed bills to be signed into law, and about 8 of those have been signed into law thus far. So, that threat is really there. I think there's a lot of acceptance rising, but the threat's still there. And then increased likelihood of struggling with substance abuse, which Cheryl, you mentioned, and I think we've said that a couple of times, but we're seeing that as a pattern across all of these special populations, that they're at that increased risk. So this data is from the Trevor Project. So the Trevor Project is a nonprofit that's really focused on providing support and research around LGBTQIA mental health in the same way that the Acoma Project does that for youth of color. So this is from their 2022 national survey, and it has responses from about 34,000 youth. So when we look at this, we can see that we've kind of broken this down in 13 to 17 and 18 to 24. And so this is 50% have considered suicide in the past year of LGBTQIA plus youth ages 13 to 17. And 37% of youth ages 18 to 24 have considered it. And we have an 18% of that 13 to 17 group attempting. And so that's a large group of attempts that falls into some of the numbers that Cheryl mentioned earlier. The same thing for experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression. All of these numbers are over 50%. So over half of all youth between 13 and 24 that were surveyed are having some sort of experience of both anxiety and depression. 36% of LGBTQ youth report being physically threatened or harmed to their identity. 45 due to their identity, I apologize. 45% of LGBTQ youth considered suicide in the last year. That's a huge number of this population considering suicide. And then we also see a lot of deficits with desire for care or inability to access care, and that can come from a fear that a provider might out you to a parent or a caregiver. That can come from a parent or a caregiver not taking needs seriously, or maybe not thinking it's the need for that care is as extensive as the child feels it is. But really making sure that we're creating that access and that we're following through is going to be huge for this population as well. And again, here's some more of the data from that Trevor Project. Just a couple of things to note on here. It is interesting over here because we do see that with the blue line, which is considered suicide, we see a 3% increase in youth that considered suicide. However, there is no change in attempts. So we have been able to mitigate some protections between the consideration and the attempt. And we're going to talk about duration in our third training throughout this series. And so we can kind of conceptualize what that means in that training. Although our data continues to show higher rates of mental health and suicide risk among LGBTQ young people, it's crucial that we see that these rates are largely based on the way they're treated. So it all kind of comes from that connection that Cheryl mentioned, from how safe they feel, from how kind of cared for that they feel. And then some other interesting data that just kind of here on the bottom is this is the percent of broken down by race and ethnicity. So 12% of white youth attempted suicide in the past year of respondents. And then we look at like 21% of our Native Indigenous youth, 19% of Black youth, 20% of Middle Eastern North African youth. So this kind of breaks it down by race and ethnicity again within the LGBTQ population. And we see some more of those numbers over here. So what do we do? What are the protective factors for this population? And some of the first things that we can kind of look at are that kind of affirming care. So whether that's sexual orientation affirming or gender affirming care, we know that that is going to definitely decrease the rates of suicide, the rates of anxiety, the rates of depression. 89% of youth reported that when they see an LGBTQIA plus member like representation in TV and media, that is a huge thing for them. And so when we see celebrities, sports players, other people that we see in the media come out or like live as their authentic self, we are kind of reducing the suicidality because it's becoming a more common thing. And then there's some different ways that youth feel supported by their family and caregivers, kind of going back to that like gender affirming, sexual orientation affirming care. And that comes with parents being welcoming of LGBTQ plus friends and partners in their home, talking to kids kindly about their identity, using preferred names and pronouns correctly, supporting their gender expression, which I think can be really difficult for certain people to kind of grasp, but there's lots of ways to do that. And then educating themselves. So kind of taking it upon yourself to do your own research and know what you can do best for the children in your home. So I think I mentioned earlier that one of the special populations we were going to talk about was kind of that rural geographic location. And so we know that rates of suicide are much higher in rural areas compared to urban areas. And when you look at some of these measurements, we can see that it's about 10.9 per 100,000 in larger metro areas that are struggling or that attempt suicide. And then when we look at those rural areas, we're looking at almost like a double in that 20.5 per 100,000 in those non-core, non-metro areas. And we know that that for a lot of reasons, access to care, community, kind of just like mindset about mental health, maybe not having access to the correct specialty. So maybe there is a therapist in the small town, but they don't treat a specific disorder that someone struggles with, etc. And so we really can do what we can to increase care. I think that over the past couple of years, we've really leaned into a lot of like telecare, whether that's telemedicine or teletherapy. And I think that that is increased a lot of access, but we still could do more and we can do better to make sure that they have access to care.
Such good information, Alex, for us to keep all of these things in front of us so that we can, respond better and be aware of those things. So such good information. I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk about some special populations with youth with intellectual and neurodevelopment disabilities. And one study I was reading is autistic youth are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide and twice more likely to die by suicide at a significant younger age compared to their non-autistic peers. At least 1 in 6 autistic youth will also contemplate suicide during their childhood, even as young as 6 years of age. So just to think about just that as we are going to dive in a little bit more here, but just knowing that about that diagnosis, hopefully it will just help you be aware of that. Intellectual disabilities do not provide protection. And here's another data: 1 in 4 autistic youth report suicidal ideation, and 1 in 10 attempt suicide. So again, there's another statistic from there. And both of these resources will be in the back so that you can do a much deeper dive into the data that these people provided and the research of which they did. Many autistic symptoms overlap with suicide risk factors, and autism is associated with Oh, Alex, I think I'm tired this afternoon. Mental health conditions. The struggles with the communication can impair their social engagement, the bullying, and the impulsivity. I think is important to just take note of. 41.8% of parents registered with the Autism Network reported that their child under the age of 25 have displayed suicidal behaviors. The average age of onset for these symptoms was as young as 8 for this study, but could be as young as 5 years of age. It also went on to say 14% of the youth with autism endorse suicidal behaviors, whereas only 0.5% of neurotypical youth of the same. So a pretty big significant difference there. Having